Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're very excited to have you all here. Thanks for taking time out of your day. My name's Kaylee. I'm with Fullscript, and we're very excited to have Rebecca McConville here today. Sorry about that. To help us understand the latest nutritional trends to enhance recovery, build muscle, and optimize endurance, among other things. Before we get started, though, I want to do a little housekeeping for everyone attending and also who's registered, just so that they know this webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending it out to, as I said, everyone who's registered at the end of the event. So you'll get a link to view it on your own time. It also lives on our website at fullscript.com/webinars. So you can always go back and find it there. And throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, in your dashboard, you'll see a questions drop-down section area on the GoToWebinar dash box where you can ask your questions. We will try to get some to take some time at the end of the presentation to go through those. So I'd like to thank you, Rebecca, for being here today. I'm going to pass it over to you to maybe do a little intro and begin your presentation, and I will come back on and see you at the end for the Q&A.
Thank you. All right, here's where we're always hoping audio works. I am Rebecca McConville. I am a sports dietitian, but also an eating disorder dietitian in the Kansas City area. I have come to specialize in the treatment of what is called REDS, or low energy availability, and we'll talk about that here within our slides. But I really wanted to speak in my career. I've really gotten to where I want to provide more athlete provider education. And I bring that up because I think for a lot of people, when they think of athlete provider, they think of the coach. They might think of the sports med physician, but honestly, all of us are seeing an athlete in some form, whether it's in a doctor's office, whether it's in a health coach realm, as a nurse, wherever it is that you're practicing, or especially as a dietitian. And so I wanted to speak today to the athlete health and how I believe that that is vastly overlooked. So it's really interesting. I was listening to a podcast not too long ago, and it was on a leading researcher in muscle synthesis, and they were basically kind of discussing the nuances in research, imagine that, and how we need to look at the context of what they're talking about and does it relate, and the relevance. And this researcher probed back a question that I found fascinating, is that there's not a single research study that actually looks at the athlete health as a marker. They might do some things indirectly. They may look at immune markers, but no one looks at if their intervention actually improves the health of athletes. And what really gets back to that is because most of the time our research is centered around improving performance. We know that the ability to complete a training program is the single most predictor of success for that athlete. So wouldn't it make sense if illness and injuries related to lack of health cause that athlete to miss more training, that perhaps we should be looking at our recommendations to optimize health to help them perform better? So that's the question I'm probing today. And I want you to think about the scenarios in which you might see that athlete in your setting, your office. I know there's lots of different practitioners here today. And what would be some of the symptoms that would make you suspect that their health may be off? Because one of the things that is really complexing is athletes can perform at a really, really high caliber, but yet not be healthy. And I think we have to do a better job of educating the athlete that they can have optimal performance and they can also have optimal health. So the objectives are, I really want to define what is foundation nutrition, learn some of the key indicators of health within a training program, describe why optimal energy availability is a crucial step before anything else can be explored, and how you can use a better athlete assessment to help personalize recommendations all season long. So this was a great infographic that came out, and so I like to use this in my office. And it's funny, I have so many athletes that come in, and when I start doing my screening and assessment, they're like, "Why do you need to know about my digestion? Why do you care how often I get viruses?" And then when I wrap up my assessment, we really start to then tie these in, and they get the big picture. Because what I need to do nutritionally, I have to make sure they're of optimal health before I can think about anything performance specific. And so the question is, do athletes have different health needs? Or are they the same as what we would call the general public? And then how do we screen differently and assess for those within our office? So some things that are key components is we know that they do need additional sleep. They usually need 8 to 10 hours, and then especially the adolescent athlete needs even more than that. So when I ask about sleep, I not only ask about how many hours, but also the quality of it. What are normal digestive patterns, including the ability to be able to tolerate nutrition before their training, if they need to take it in during and then after? So that would be something that would be very specific to that athlete population, but also tends to be a preliminary sign of health dysfunction that will get in the way of their performance. Also look at what I call body resiliency, and that's the avoidance of overtraining related injuries, stress fractures, IT bands, tendonitis. When they are starting to have repeat injuries like these, we need to look at, are they getting enough nutrition? Are they getting enough nutrition that helps them with recovery? And do we need to make adjustments accordingly? I also look at emotional resilience. And I feel like it's within my scope, especially as an eating disorder dietitian, that we know that we start to see changes in cognition, we see changes in mood when we don't have enough adequate nutrition. And it was really cool. There was a consensus statement that came out 2 years ago by IOC, which is the International Olympic Committee, on mental health. And in that position statement, they spoke to the fact that if before you can rule out depression, you need to ensure that that athlete has adequate nutrition and have them take 3 days off from training. If symptoms improve, then you know that it was a lack of recovery and a lack of nutrition. If they don't, then we're probably looking at a clinical depression diagnosis. The other things are hormonal health. Are they having amenorrhea? So they're having normal cycles. Are they having a normal hormone panel, thyroid function? Do they have nutritional sufficiency? So looking at iron, how often do we need to check that within his training season? Vitamin D, B12, folate, white blood cell counts, and obviously we're looking at personalized nutrition. So if they have struggled with any issues or if they have any co-conditions that might impact their nutritional status, we want to make sure that we're screening for that as well. Another key component is continued growth patterns. When you're working with that adolescent, for example, I had a younger athlete in here today that had been seen for 3 years for amenorrhea. Probably in just hasn't really had somebody that dug as much into the assessment, and she has not made any progress on her growth curve for height for the last 3.5 years. So that means growth has actually been stunted, even though she's continued to perform at a high caliber, because she's not getting in enough adequate nutrition. And so to me, when I see all these things in my office, I view these as not markers of health and things that we need to address first before we start looking at performance. So do nutrition recommendations differ? So of course, like the political answer, yes and no. There are some things that are more specific to athletes. Other things are as if the general public. So iron, vitamin D, maybe B12 and folate when we look at vitamins and minerals. But where we do see a difference is when we look at carb, protein, and fat. And I'm going to speak to that in a minute. But the only way that you get to that point to be able to assess and identify if they do need different nutritional recommendations is a very thorough evaluation. So this is one that I had the joy of partnering with the Better Nutrition Program to develop. And so right off the bat, we talk about, like, what are your performance goals? Who set those? What have you done in the past to try to get to those performance goals? Did they even improve that? And then it goes in more and looks at digestive patterns. What sports products have you tried? What lab work have you had? And have you checked it to make sure that it's optimal, not necessarily chronic disease prevention? And so we have to have a holistic assessment when we're working with athletes. So I love when I have the opportunity to work with younger dietitians, especially sports dietitians, that we can't just focus on how much their calorie needs are and then giving them with the meal plan. We need to make sure that all these things are in line during their training and what we might need to do differently. This also gives us the opportunity to have personalized, proactive, and I use that word with emphasis because one of the things that I work through my book and my course on REDS is I think that we can set up speed bumps for that athlete to stay in optimal health, to stay in optimal performance, and not have any of these markers of dysfunction all season long. So this was taken from the position statement with Sports Medicine and Academy of Dietetics, but basically they shifted the recommendations a couple of years ago from percents, where sometimes nutrition may be, okay, 50% of your calories should come from carbohydrates. We know that particular, if it's a power sport, if it's endurance sport, they're going to need more carbohydrates, especially around glycogen. So they based it according to the amount of activity, but also what they're needing from their body. So you'll see something that would be considered light in volume, but low intensity or skill based needs about 3 to 5 grams of kilogram per day carbohydrates. When we get into moderate, high, and then very high, and it actually gives some hour suggestions, 4 to 5 hours, they need 8 to 12 grams per kilogram day. When they miss the mark, we end up finding the body starts to give us some signals. And this is also counterintuitive from what our culture says, which usually tells them to limit their carb or they focus on a percent. We really need that personalized recommendation. Same thing goes for our other macronutrients. So protein, depending on if endurance, power-based, strength-based, and the difference between that would be, my power lifters versus like a lineman on a football team. They're going to need different energy systems. Therefore, they're going to need different energy breakdown. Fat is generally kept the same. And so that's an easy recommendation to fill in. We want that to look around the same. I firmly believe, though, that the single most contributor to poor athlete health is underfueling. I know we are in a culture that talks about in excess, but our athletes grasp onto that. And in my work around eating disorders, we talk about that they have a mentality and a body image of not only that athlete, but also someone in society. So when you go to Google what a 22-year-old female that's wanting to run a marathon is, you're going to get a vast array of caloric needs, somewhere between 800 calorie discrepancies. And so when we get caught up on this calories in versus calories out, we miss the mark and the body starts to show signs of dysfunction. So I believe what contributes to this is a very diet focused, weight obsessed culture. I'm sure many of you saw the New York Times piece with Mary Kane and how even though she was running at world record paces, that she was beating women twice her age, she was pressured to continue to restrict her intake, continue to lose weight. And despite the fact that she was actually running slower, they continued to encourage this until she actually became suicidal. It's a very heartbreaking story. They follow fad diets that are not intended for athletes. So I saw this with a lot of popularity with keto. And while Louise Burke has continued to try to study, and also in sports literature, they would call it fat adapted athletes, they may contribute to increased body fat stores being used as an energy source. But what ends up happening, and it's always mentioned in the discussion, it's never mentioned as something to discourage a recommendation, is their IL-6, which is an inflammatory marker, would increase. They would have more upper respiratory infections towards the latter part of their training, that they would miss some of their training days, and they actually saw more injury risk the longer that they did the lower fat diets. I see an over reliance on technology versus listening to body's wisdom. So they have all the gadgets and gizmos that you could ever think of that are looking at their heart rate data, they're looking at their sleep information, they're looking at how many calories they think that they've expended. And while those are fantastic data points, I also reference back to the body. Okay, how did you feel when you woke up? Okay, your heart rate was hitting this max heart rate. How hard were you having to work to do that? So we can tie in if that's a reliable source and if we need to make any changes accordingly. In our athletic population, we tend to see an underestimating of expenditure, but actually overestimating intake, which may be counterintuitive from what we hear in the general public, but that's what I've seen in my years of working with athletes. So one of the things that's really important is to walk them through what happens when they're trying to either stay within this calories in equals calories out trap. What is that body telling them? So you'll see this as an example off the assessment. Are you having a menstrual cycle? How many days are in between your cycle? Have there been any changes? Are you sleeping? Are you waking up rested? These are likely questions that an athlete has never even considered in regards to their performance. They also have probably not even acknowledged that it's a problem until it's been brought up in assessment. And I like to always use examples of athletes that have struggled in. Tiger Woods, for example, has actually been studied for chronic insomnia. And they noticed some of his times that he tended to have knee and back injuries, which you're going to have as a professional golfer anyways. He also struggled most with his mental health. So they've linked a lot of his chronic insomnia to his physical and mental health issues that he has had. So this leads us to what is now being referred to as low energy availability. Some of you may have heard this before as the female athlete triad, which was the triangle of weight changes seen in an athlete, a menstrual cycle that has ceased for 3 months or more, and a stress fracture or compromised bone density. But as they've been able to gather more information, one, they realized they excluded males. The other thing is going back to that infograph with all those organ systems, what happens when there is not energy available? So the body views their training, their competing as the #1 stressor, and it prioritizes all the energy for that. Then the rest of the body gets what energy is left over. So this was taken from, Laux was the first to study this. This was from a Hallmark study looking at how much energy needs to be available for fat-free mass, so for vital organs to function. And what they found was that it needs to be between 40 to 45 to see optimal health, especially hormonal health. And so here's an example of an athlete that was 155 pounds, had body composition at 20%, thought they had been trying to cut their body fat, so they had reduced their calories to 1,800, had been doing HIIT classes for 6 days, which estimated by their watch, they were usually burning 500. And you can see that the energy availability for this athlete was 23. So the danger zone was actually no more than 2,100, or excuse me, no less than 2,100. And optimally, they needed to be consuming 3,000 calories. So it's very confusing messages, but I like to walk them through this. And I also like to see, like, what was the story your body was telling us as you moved to less energy available and we moved towards more energy available? How did you feel? How did you perform? So now I want to talk a little bit more in depth when there is not energy available. How does it impact their health? And then I'm also going to weave in how it impacts their performance and what things to look at when that athlete is in your clinic, practice, or however you see them. This was taken from the Gatorade Sport Institute, and I thought it was interesting. This is the 10 risk factors for infection in athletes. So number one is common cold and flu season. I'm sure at some point that's just going to be updated for COVID. And then, you know, the next three are really kind of not necessarily directly impacted by nutrition, but from there on out, they're all directly, or I believe directly related to nutrition. Life stress, depression, and anxiety, how that can impact their nutrition choices and how much they're eating. Low energy availability is listed 6, poor sleep, an increase in training load, national versus international level of competition and travel, which maybe that doesn't necessarily directly impact nutrition, but their choices are more difficult, and low mucosal immunity. Again, getting them to think in context of, am I eating enough? Am I eating enough balance of my nutrition can help me prevent these infections that keep me from participating in my sport. So I feel like we owe it to start out with the brain, right? The brain, I believe, is the most underappreciated muscle. And when we look at preliminary markers of low energy availability, while this is very difficult to assess, you'll hear them say they just didn't seem like themselves. They seemed off. They seemed more withdrawn. And I often educate, well, remember that food creates neurotransmitters, and neurotransmitters create our mood. So I don't have research to concretely back this up, but I have a hypothesis as to why we are seeing an increase in suicidality and depression within our athletic population is because of their poor nutritional status, demand that's on their body, and their brain is not able to recover and heal the way that it needs to. And as I spoke to earlier, that position statement from the IOC even speaks that let them take 3 days off, give them proper nutrition during that time, and let's see how the brain reacts. It's kind of like if there were tired legs. If we just take 3 days off and now that injury goes away and you start back to running and it's not hurting, it just needed rest. There wasn't anything chronic that was wrong. Another key factor is this isn't just about low energy availability. It's also about glucose availability. We understand that even if they are at a proper calorie level, but somebody has done a really low carbohydrate diet, or they're not giving enough carbs at those windows of opportunity, we also see a delay in cognition. Not only cognition, but we also see a delay in their physical movements and reaction time. Another part is it decreases the ability for serotonin turnover, and so that's where we get that more flat effect. Performance-wise, we see an increased sympathetic nervous system response. So they actually have altered heart rate variability that doesn't make a lot of sense. So one of the things I'll ask them is, okay, as you reach your max heart rate, what was your rate of perceived exertion? So that's how hard they're working. And it would make sense that if they're hitting their max heart rate, they should probably tell me that their rate of perceived exertion is 9 or 10. As they improve their fitness and training, that max heart rate, if they stay at that, should go down with rate of perceived exertion, or they should be able to push themselves at a harder limit. And so when we see numbers not to start to add up, there is probably a sympathetic response. Those adrenals are getting taxed due to the underfueling. This impedes the body's ability to recover. It also impedes their ability to progress with the prescribed training plan. So they start hitting walls, they're having to make adjustments to their training, and they're not able to move with either the volume or the intensity. The behavior starts to present as actually one of more anxiousness. So in that athletic realm, they may be told they're inattentive, they're not paying attention. They may actually have heightened performance anxiety that comes out of nowhere. or they may just present as withdrawn. Teammates may comment that they just don't want to do as much activities, or they don't seem as excited about their sport that they do. Performance-wise, we see a decreased reaction time. So right now, there's actually research that is exploring things like ACL, things like tendonitis, when there is a low energy available window, because we have central fatigue, which is when the brain fatigues, and then we have peripheral fatigue, which is when the body fatigues. And if there's a delay in what the brain is telling the muscle to contract and push off or protect in a movement, then they're not able to protect the body. And so that's where we see things like knees being over the plane, or falls or things like that as well. So there's poor coordinated movements, which actually increases injury risk. So one thing I teach is there needs to be consistency with meals and snacks, because we're getting that glucose up to the brain, and to listen to those cravings. A lot of times, if they're not getting enough of a particular nutrient, they will start to crave and desire that. And while I know that could be a whole nother presentation, that's one thing that I try to teach them as well. Another one is the athlete's gut. And so there was another article, and this alludes to it and cited below, that almost 85% of athletes will present with irritable bowel type symptoms, but yet we're usually fifth on the list to have that athlete come for recommendations. And so what do? They end up cutting out particular food groups. They end up feeling pain or discomfort, and so they end up eating less. It's really hard for them to take in nutrition before, during, and after, because we already have a stressed gut, and so this compounds the factor. And so there's also a fantastic book called The Athlete's Gut. It's actually called The Athlete's Gut by Dr. Patrick Wilson. And he speaks to the fact that one of the number one symptoms of GI, or excuse me, the number one cause of GI symptoms is an underfueled gut, because it becomes a weakened gut. And again, going back to the difference between winning and losing is sometimes being able to maintain intensity. And when they have done food log records of some of your top Ironman athletes, they consume the highest amount of fuel, specifically carbohydrates, per hour. So we really have to get these athletes to buy in that your fueling is not directly related to what you think your ideal weight is or what you've been told, but when all these organs are telling them that they're at optimal health, and the gut is a big one. The other thing too is screening for things like bloating, diarrhea, constipation, cramping, specifically in that post window. So when they're engaged in activity, blood flow goes away from the gut. So we know that that becomes more permeable. Core temperature goes up within that gut, and that integrity is compromised. So if they've properly hydrated, if they have properly given themselves enough carbohydrates and fueling in that window, they can protect that integrity. If not, then we start to see more issues, including even blood and stool after something really strenuous like a marathon or an ultra endurance event. The other part is we will see them start to have more hypothermia. Their core temperature goes up, and we see a stressor response similar to what we would see like in leaky gut. Last but not least, they have poor gut emptying. So then they may try to do rescue hydration or rescue nutrition, and they feel like it just sits in the gut and doesn't empty. And there's some truth to that at that point. And now they can't get caught up to make up for what they've lost. So I strongly encourage you to assess and look at their gut health. Ask them how this is impacted by not only training load, but training intensity, and how do they tend to manage it? Because it's really critical that they still be able to get their nutrition in before. And again, that's another thing we now know within 2 weeks, you can train the gut to be able to take in nutrition. We start small and build up. We can also train them to be able to tolerate nutrition during their training. and also in that recovery window afterwards. One of the things that's really important, and this is where Fullscript has been very beneficial for me. If we do, through the Better Nutrition program, I've also been able to help with some athlete-specific recommendations. And there are key nutrients that what I call typical labs do not meet. And the reason for this is most of the labs and lab ranges that we use are meant for disease prevention. But if that athlete is requiring more of that nutrient for their amount of training, for their growth, for even runners, for example, if they're hill strikers, they can actually rupture red blood cells and require more iron, then we need to make sure that they have sufficient store. So I'm going to give you two examples. One is iron. So when you usually get blood work done at labs, they put 10 as the lower end for deficiency, but per athletic standards, again set by the IOC, actually 22 is viewed as anemic. So I see this all the time. I'll say, make sure you bring your labs in. Let's go over that, even if you've been told you have normal lab values, and let's make sure we're addressing it accordingly. Same thing with vitamin D, and I do have literature here to support it in case anybody wants to read that. 22 is usually set at the end for deficient, but in our athletic population, it's at 50. And I firmly believe in a foundation first with food. But the exception is if an athlete comes in and they are in a low energy availability state, they also have low iron or low vitamin D, that we do have to supplement and correct that along as we improve energy. And the reason for this is because especially when they're in an anemic state, it creates what I call a metabolic tax. And the body has to work harder to metabolize foods and to expend on energy. And so it actually is counterproductive when we're trying to improve that energy status. So I will go ahead and supplement iron and vitamin D at that time, and then wait until they're in a better energy status to determine if we need to do long-term supplementation. The other thing is if they have had repeat bouts, they recommend that you screen for anemia up to 4 times a year. So I will generally have them checked at the start of a training program and then also at the end. So it helps me as a clinician to figure out if my nutritional recommendations have been working, and then what do we need to do differently moving forward. So again, going back to that personalized recommendation. And if you would like more information about how to use those assessments, feel free to direct message me or email. I also can provide you with the link to get a discount as well, if you're interested. Drink of water. So this could have its own presentation, but I obviously need to give it some attention, what's known as FHA, functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, but we're going to refer to it as HPA. Goes back to the brain, not only sensing low energy availability, but also low glucose availability. Once the brain senses that, it starts this cascade. And so cortisol is actually increased. It's trying to free up stores of glucose to regulate blood sugar. But if this continues to happen, it's actually in a more chronic state, which increases risk of injury. The other thing too is, again, if those adrenals continue to be taxed, then we see this sympathetic response. And there could be two things. At first, we see a heightened one. Then if it continues on, we see a flattened one. So they are working and working and working. And it may be somebody that comes in to see you that says, gosh, you know, I'm putting all this into my workouts, but yet I don't feel like I'm making the progress that I should. And at this point, it's because this functional access has shut off to conserve energy. We then see the luteinizing hormone surge decrease, and then subsequently estrogen follows that. And where this is really critical is when we start talking about bone health And we also start talking about heart health. And I didn't speak to heart health specifically on this presentation, but I think it's important to mention that we don't just dismiss a low heart rate and call it an athlete heart. Many times when estrogen is low, it's actually a dilator within that. And so we'll see changes in their orthostatics. We will also see a decrease in their VO2 max, which means how much oxygen flow can go to that heart for them to do their training. And when estrogen and testosterone is low, we see a drop in that VO2 max. Cycle is viewed as abnormal when it has reached less than 6 cycles a year or 3 months in a row for it to be defined as amenorrhea. However, again, I expressed that I want to be more proactive. If they start to tell me that they feel like there's more days going within their cycle, they're not noticing the physical symptoms as strong as they would when they usually are before their cycle, or if males tell me they're having a drop in their sex drive or they're not waking up with a morning erection, then I say we need to flag that and make sure that we're not missing something so we can address that health. And I know right now they're really talking about how menstrual cycle and hormonal health should be viewed as a vital sign, which means that we need to be assessing and continuing to assess it as well. This gets more confusing because just as I've had in my office, so many will come in and be like, well, I wasn't hungry, so therefore I didn't eat my snack. Or, gosh, I just noticed that I was getting fuller quicker. And within a 250 to 300 calorie disruption, so I want you to think about that. That is very easy to do. It could be that they changed out their bar. They started using a different bread, or they started increasing their fiber so they got fuller, or their protein, to start this cascade of disruption that ends up leading to hormonal changes, but also metabolic signaling. So leptin, which is secreted from our body fat, at first will try to increase the hunger, but what ends up happening is if that HPA axis is dysfunctional, it becomes muted. And so they lose their drive to eat. And it's really hard to eat. Plus, you think of our message in our culture, they'll tell you, you don't eat when you're not hungry and you stop when you're full. Well, if our body is trying to conserve energy by not looking for food or digesting food, then we don't have that signal there to begin with. The other part is energy expenditure from exercise actually decreases ghrelin, so our hunger, up to 4 hours post exercise. So it's really important that sometimes we have to have scripted nutritional recommendations. And while intuitive eating is great, I think this is where we have to tell them, you need to eat this particular recovery snack or meal within this window, and hopefully your hunger is going to return for dinner or the next meal. But even though you're not hungry, you need to continue to do this. The other part is athletes are looking for that competitive edge. So they are going to be very susceptible to following many popular trends. And right now, there's been an emphasis on high volume, low energy foods that cause them to be what I call fake full. So they eat them. It takes a while to eat. They get in the stomach, they swell, they tell the brain they're full, but there's not enough calories there. So it continues this confusion about, why would I be eating if I'm full, and why would I be losing weight, or why would I start to have these negative health consequences as a result. And that's why it's important to have a structured meal plan along with structure increases when they're having changes in their training, to try to prevent that in case these hunger and fullness signals become dysfunctional. And I always think that's funny. I have to admit, I love the Snickers commercial with hangry, because we really do become anxious and irritable when our blood sugar is getting low, which can happen, which also means for that athlete, they're not going to be attentive, they're not going to be focused, and they're not going to be performing at their best. Then we move on to bone health. And so this probably gets their attention the most. This is probably also what gets them into my office the quickest, is a stress fracture. And they're trying to recover from the stress fracture. So athletes with amenorrhea are 2 to 3 times the risk to develop stress fractures. And I love this image because I think it really helps hone in on the difference in their microstructure within a bone. So you'll see in the non-athlete, it is not as dense in between the bone matrix. And then you've got a eumenic athlete, so it's got gravity that's straining, that's making this nice, dense, more cortical tissue within the bone. Then you have the amenorrheic athlete, and you'll see how the outside is actually starting to thin. You'll also see where there's a lot more almost like air, and so we've lost the tissue density. The other part is going back to where we talked about cortisol. And so inside that bone can actually become more inflamed. We see less nutrients. And then now, because we've got insufficient energy, more than likely calcium has been leaching from this bone to give the body stores, as well as vitamin D. So we have a nutrient poor bone as well. This is critical when we're working with adolescent athletes because their growth can actually be stunted and compromise bone development. And I would like to see more proactive DEXA scans looking at bone density, because I have actually had 3 athletes under the age of 15. And I know you don't diagnose osteoporosis at that age, but they met by their scores for that much compromised bone density. On the flip side, I have had older athletes that have been postmenopausal, that have struggled with energy availability, that we've actually been able to restore bone density. So I firmly believe with prescribed nutrition, restoring energy availability, I have certain supplement protocols that I follow that regardless of age, we can restore this important marker of health. While right now we're talking about athletes, you think about when somebody becomes older, one of their loss of quality of life is a hip fracture, and then they're unable to take care of themselves and do the things that they want to do. And so I want to be able to prevent that when they're younger, but also even as my older athletes be able to continue that. I have a really cool one that had a bad bike crash. She actually does triathlons, and she hasn't been able to race for 2 years. She had, I mean, like traumatic injuries from this bike crash, but she's 76, and she's going to try to qualify for nationals. So we don't need to put ages when we look at athletes. We don't need to categorize. If there is an athletic endeavor that they want to do, we can properly fuel them, get them at proper optimal health, and let them compete as long as they want to. Sometimes we see this complicated when there's an increase in dairy avoidance and lack of calcium awareness, meaning sometimes they may be consuming, or they've cut out calcium items that they believe are calcium rich, or they're inconsistent. So we need to be able to provide them that valuable education. Recommendations continue to be, oh, my apologies, I missed a 0 on that, 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams. If they cannot get that from intake alone, that's where supplementation is very important. Last but not least, because we've been talking about health, this was another great diagram that actually talks about the lack of energy availability and how it, decreased their performance. So we know that we see decreased coordination, we see impaired judgment, an inability to approve with their training program. They actually have increased injury risk. They decrease in their endurance performance. They actually hit a wall and they lose mitochondria in their muscle, so they're not able to do the volume that they used to. Decreased muscle strength because that muscle doesn't have the energy to resynthesize and build. There's decreased glycogen stores. We see more depression, irritability, and decreased concentration. So this is, again, why I think keeping that athlete healthy all season long is critical, and how we have a critical role in helping them optimize their performance. So that very first slide that we talked about, the athlete health and infection, this is why infection is incompatible with success. Medal winners actually suffer fewer and shorter upper respiratory infections. Infection is the second most common reason to present to a team medic after an injury. Sickness correlates negatively with training volume. Illness accounts for 1/3 of lost training days. 2/3 of illnesses result in time lost from training and competition, and 1/3 of illnesses result in performance restriction. Below the neck symptoms increase the likelihood of not finishing an endurance event. So that's actually what they're speaking to, GI related, and do not finish is a huge culprit. Heavy exercise can actually extend an ongoing infection, and heavy exercise during infection or incomplete recovery can lead to medical emergencies. So illness is thrown out kind of broadly, but to me, bone stress fractures are a part of illness. The lack of menstrual cycle is an illness. You know, the lack of hunger signals, body signals, all of these, we need to use the term health, that these are markers of health, and we need to keep these in check all season long. And so in conclusion, we just have to remember that athletes are humans, and they have human needs and challenges. So they're trying to perform at top caliber. They also may have kids that are in activities in school, or they're stressed as they transition to high school or in college. We have to optimize adequate nutrition with energy availability. The data speaks that they need to be in a surplus of 300 calories to protect that cascade starting up in the brain. We need to focus on prevention of nutritional deficiencies with prescribed, personalized nutritional recommendations and supplementation as needed. And I believe at least twice a year, if not more than that, we need to conduct a holistic nutrition assessment for performance, because goals will change. Again, athletes are human, so they're going to change, and their life stressors are going to change, and our recommendations are going to change accordingly. So we have to support our nutrition recommendations so that we can always have their back. Well, here's LeBron James. I have to say Michael Jordan's the greatest of all times. If you'd like more information on REDS or low energy availability, I do have a book called Finding Your Sweet Spot. I have a course that's actually designed for clinicians that's 8 weeks long on this. And then you are also can get more information on the nutrition assessment that I have done with the Better Nutrition program. And if you'd like to follow me, Instagram, I'm Rebecca ED Dietitian, or you can go to my website. And if you have any questions post-presentation, you can find me there. And now I'd like to open up and see if there's any questions at this time.
All right, thank you so much. That's great. We can share in our follow-up email as well a link to the website and any links if you'd like to connect the audience to the books that you, or even the resources you mentioned. We can definitely add that to the follow-up email with the recording. We did get quite a few questions in. So if you want, if we have time to, you can still add your questions in. We'll try to get to them. One of the first ones that came through is that one of the audience said that they're a newer coach and have found a few young athletes testing low for testosterone levels. So I think you kind of touched on it, but what were your recommendations for male athletes and lower testosterone levels?
First of all, that makes me happy that they're being tested for it. They need to be treated similarly as if it was a female athlete with amenorrhea. So addressing that they have enough energy availability, providing education at that point. They're high risk. Actually, males are higher risk for stress fractures with low testosterone than women are with low estrogen. So making sure adequate calcium, adequate vitamin D, and really stressing the importance of getting enough nutrition at that time. It can take a few months for those levels to restore, but they will start to see it in their strength improvement, their endurance improvement, and energy improvement as well. Thank you for that question.
Yeah. A couple questions that came through on, I guess, specific diets. So what is your take on gluten and or dairy free for athletes? Is that something you generally recommend? And another question too that came through is the common problems or concerns you see with athletes that are on the keto diet, ketogenic diet.
I would only recommend gluten-free if they have celiac or if it's pretty identifiable intolerance. One thing, I mean, again, just going back to just their life, is if they're traveling with teams or if they're, one of many in a family, does it increase the complexity of them being able to feed themselves? And so if we can try to do it with more gluten containing items, then that is probably better off for them. However, if they know that that definitely is a culprit, they have GI issues or if it's increasing their inflammation, I talk about what is our lateral change. So if we have cut out particular foods that are gluten containing, what foods are we bringing back in that are going to match that nutritionally so we're not creating any deficiencies? Same thing with dairy. And sometimes too, I will admit that athletes are more prone to dairy issues because going back to that gut integrity in that post-exercise window. So while we may not cut out dairy all day long, we might need to in that recovery window because their gut won't be able to handle it. So what products can we use that are going to be comparable to what they need for their recovery nutrition? And then the keto, right now there has not been any supportive literature because the problem is it takes out the carbohydrate, and we know that athletes need that for glycogen stores. They need that for the brain. They also need it to bring down cortisol. So in the studies that they have done, lower carbohydrate diets, we saw more illness and more injury.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, another one came through, I think it was closer to the beginning of your presentation in the optimal versus deficient slide. Can you explain again what you mean by, or when you say that the minimum deficiency rate is different between an athlete and the common population?
Yes. So most lab values that are set are what are those nutrient stores that help prevent chronic deficiencies. And so we don't want a deficiency in that. We don't want a deficiency in general, but we specifically don't because we know that they are going to have more iron turnover. We know that they're going to have more vitamin D turnover, and those two have been studied exclusively in athletic populations, hence the literature that I gave you. So therefore, those ranges that are set for disease prevention would actually create a state of deficiency within the athlete. I hope I answered that.
And yeah, I think so. And no, these are great. I know you talked about, you had slides on bone health and bone healing, but what supplement protocols would you recommend for bone healing? Do you have specific ones, I guess?
They have definitely had diagnosed compromised bone density through a DEXA. I really like the Bone Up supplement between the vitamin K, calcium, vitamin D, and magnesium. I will have them do that for at least 2 to 3 months until either we have confirmed bone healing from, if it's an orthopedic surgeon, or they've had a repeat DEXA. And then some athletes have just chosen because it's improved their density enough to stay on it long term. If not, we typically do 2,000 IUs of vitamin D and then at least 500 to 1,000 milligrams of calcium daily, depending on their age as well.
Actually, another one just came through for kind of along the diet questions too. Any advice for vegan athletes and what foods they can include to ensure protein and carbs as well?
Sure. So in that, again, it goes back to like the lateral. So if we, in bilateral, just making sure we're switching out things that are equal, looking at having two good sources at every meal. And so filling up that pantry, what things can I add into breakfast that ensure I get enough protein? What things, if let's say I'm cutting out dairy, and so I'm limited in what I can have for breakfast. Okay, what things can we fortify? Let's use some hemp hearts. Let's use some flaxseed. Let's do some textured vegetable protein. That way I'm boosting up that meal to get those protein targets. I think between either having consistency with having two sources and then fortifying with some of these other things to improve protein, it's very doable for them to hit their targets.
Awesome. I think we'll wrap up with a couple of like recommendation questions that came through. So we had a couple questions about any books that you recommend on optimal nutrition for athletes, or any courses that you recommend someone who wants to specify in athletes' health and nutrition. Any books or courses that you recommend in that direction?
Oh gosh, can I plug my own? I mean, that's
Yeah, definitely.
basically that's what my 8-week course that is approved for CEUs goes a whole lot more in depth into the things that we talked about. And then my book is written more towards the athlete and like parent, but it talks about low energy availability. Some of the other great books that are out there, the Nancy Clark Sports Nutrition Guidebook, and then Dr. Stacy Sims Roar, and it's more specific to the female athlete. There is a new book out, I'll admit I haven't got to purchase yet and read, but about the masters athlete. That is the biggest growing population of those in endurance, but we really have no good science behind it. And unfortunately, they consider 35 and older a masters athlete. So I'm in that category as well. So hopefully I gave you enough good suggestions there.
Yeah, I think that's great. I know we're kind of hitting that time mark. We want to recognize people's time. So I'll wrap up. But as I said, we'll try to pass as many resources as we can through a follow-up. If you have more questions, you want to email webinars@fullscript.com. I can pass them along as well, or head to Rebecca's website or follow her on social media as well. Again, just a reminder, I know I just said it for the follow-up, but the recording will be shared as well, and you can find it on Fullscript's website at fullscript.com/webinars. But again, thank you so much for being here. I learned a ton, so I really enjoyed it, and yeah, we hope to see you again very soon. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day.